We begin tonight with a string of attacks targeting rideshare drivers. In a single week, there have been 6 armed robberies and 5 carjackings. Drivers are fed up.
So if it wasn't bad enough that drivers for Uber and Lyft have recently gotten 50% pay cuts because of the city's new ride-sharing rules, when they do get passengers, sometimes those are criminals targeting them for their phones and their keys.
Take a close look at these men who enter the backseat of a rideshare. Police say they've stolen from drivers on 24 different occasions throughout the city.
Uber drivers protesting the company over lockout allegations. Many of them are getting unfairly locked out of the app, preventing them from working.
He rolled down his window and says 4 teens approached him. This is video of the aftermath. The gun was then pointed at Juan.
And said, give me everything, give me the money, give me everything.
Uber and Lyft are costing drivers hundreds of dollars every single week.
This is not fair. They can't do this. Everybody has a right.
City regulations require drivers to be compensated for the time they're waiting for a dispatch. Uber and Lyft started to lock drivers out of the app during their shifts, preventing them from making money and limiting drivers when there's less demand.
Once in the vehicle, the suspects ask the driver to change the destination of their drop-off. They then take the driver's cell phone as the app is open and run.
We have had upwards of 6 armed robberies and 5 carjackings.
These are pictures they released of the suspects.
So Uber is now locking drivers out of its app so that it can avoid paying them. But what nobody's talking about is that if the drivers for these companies, if they're not making money, it means the company's not making money. And when you combine that with the higher prices we're all paying to use these services, it's a total disaster for everyone, especially the drivers who are now putting their lives on the line when they go to work, getting randomly targeted for their phones and wallets. But you know who this is good for? Our local officials, who critics say meddle in the ride-sharing business for their own personal gain. Because every year since Uber and Lyft started doing business in New York, there have just been more and more laws and rules regarding their existence, which critics say just exist to funnel money over to the taxi lobby. Yet for some reason, rideshare drivers still don't earn fair wages, and the criminals targeting them are still on the streets. And now, due to some recent rule changes made by the city over how drivers get paid, they're making about half what they were. Which is a problem because New York is one of the most expensive cities to own a car with very high insurance rates, meaning that drivers for these apps have the deck stacked against them from the moment they get up in the morning. And critics say the very laws that were meant to ensure fair pay for everyone have had the opposite effect. And that's why city regulators are now threatening these companies with even more rules if they don't stop their anti-worker behavior. But proponents of how these companies are operating say they have no choice but to stop people from working because the city's rules force every driver to get paid, even if they aren't with a passenger, all in the name of fairness and equity. But that brings us to the real reason why these once profitable companies are now trending in the wrong direction. Our local leaders have this intense desire to just crack down on them and tell them how to run their businesses. But to non-rideshare drivers who vote, Uber drivers look like modern-day indentured servants, stuck in an endless cycle of work that never ends or earns them enough money to move up the economic ladder. And to every Uber driver out there, the idea of higher pay doesn't sound terrible, especially when the work they do gets more dangerous every single week. But that's got local regulators in a tough situation, because the more they crack down on these companies to try to make things better for drivers who are under attack when they're driving around because of our laws, which don't punish criminals, less drivers end up getting the work they need to survive, and the companies lose money, which is terrible news for everyone except the criminals looking for their next target. This is crazy. Most of the cars on the road here over by Penn Station, they're all rideshare drivers with TLC plates, and there are over 100,000 such vehicles in the city. TLC, 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 Mach-E. You got the best rideshare on the road, man.
Thank you.
It's hot. TLC, Taxi and Limousine Commission. They regulate how these drivers get paid. But the real problem they're having now is that criminals have shut down so many of our small businesses. The only businesses left to target are drivers in their vehicles trying to make a living.
He rolled down his window and says 4 teens approached him. This is video of the aftermath taken by the woman who actually requested the Uber.
One of the kids said, no, that's not our car. So they walk away. I'm sitting like this. I look towards the right.
The NYPD says a gun was then pointed.
So our crime is so crazy and so out of control, crooks are targeting these drivers when they stop somewhere to pick up a passenger who's not the criminal, obviously. In this report, we have teenagers that surrounded a black Uber when the gentleman stopped to pick up a passenger and then decided that was the moment to try and steal his vehicle and his wallet. Even worse, apparently they were armed with an illegal weapon of some sort, and there were several of them. That's absolutely terrifying. And this isn't an isolated incident. Recently, there have been 5 carjackings, 6 armed robberies. And what's really terrible about this is that these thugs, they're stealing the driver's method of making a living. That's what happens when you steal their car. And what are they doing it for? A quick joyride? Maybe some money in the ashtray? Access to a phone that's not theirs? It's terrible. And a lot of times the vehicle they're using, it might be rented from somebody else, which means they've got a big loss on their hands right there. Might not be able to get another one. And if it's their personal vehicle and it gets stolen, even with insurance, there's going to be deductibles, there's going to be potential premium increases. This is a disaster. And this is going to keep hardworking people who are just trying to make a living out of work for weeks. Which, coincidentally, is the second thing that's just really hammering these drivers right now, because the app companies they work for aren't even allowing them to log in and make a living.
Rideshare drivers rallied at Zuccotti Park, protesting getting locked out of the Uber and Lyft apps on their shifts. In order to operate, the Taxi and Limousine Commission says Uber and Lyft combined need to have passengers riding in their cars 53% of the time.
So what's happening here is these drivers, they're getting blocked from logging into these apps to accept rides because the TLC that licenses all of these rideshare vehicles, they changed the rules for how drivers need to be paid even when they're not with a passenger. For example, now the city's rules say that if you work 8 hours a day and only maybe 4 of those hours are spent with passengers in the actual car, you still have to be paid for idle time, which makes a lot of sense when you think about rising costs and how that affects drivers. Fuel costs more, insurance costs more, cars go through wear and tear just by running and being on these streets. These are some pretty rough streets. But the problem here is the app companies, they're only making money when the driver's got a passenger. They're not making money when the driver's not working. And even though this isn't a new rule that idle time has to be compensated, about a year ago, the TLC let a whole bunch of new drivers enter the system, and now there's a surplus of drivers. And the sad thing is that it looks like these companies have overhired, and they're effectively now laying people off.
City regulations require drivers to be compensated for the time they're waiting for a dispatch. Uber and Lyft started to lock drivers out of the app during their shifts, preventing them from making money and limiting drivers when there's less demand.
So the reason drivers are so upset is because the amount of money they're making has essentially been cut in half. And what's sad is they've started making less money after rules were enacted to help protect them and help them make more. According to the New York Post, rideshare drivers they spoke to are now making less than $200 a day, where in the past they were making between $300 and $350 a day, which is a 50% pay cut at a time when all of the costs associated with doing this for a living are going up. Drivers report being incredibly depressed and disheartened, and who can blame them when the same thing that you're doing today gets you half what it did yesterday? But the ride-sharing companies, they say that this whole system of having to pay for idle time, it's not exactly fair for them either. And that's because of the way idle time is calculated. Apparently, all of the drivers are viewed by the city as just a gigantic pool of workers that are shared among multiple companies. And when those multiple companies contribute to idle time, they each have to pay their portion of it. But since Uber has more drivers than Lyft, and Uber drivers tend to be busier than Lyft drivers, the idle time of the Lyft drivers is bumping up the idle time of the drivers for Uber. That's offsetting, in Uber's opinion, the profitability of their drivers, making them pay more than they should be. Now, the goal here is to make it so rideshare drivers earn a fair living wage no matter who it is that they're working for, and that they don't get taken advantage of by any of these big multi-million-dollar companies. But those same companies figured out that if they were to just lock people out of their apps and not let them log in, the idle time number would go down and they'd end up saving money. Which essentially puts progressive rule makers in a no-win situation, because these companies, they don't care what the laws are. They just care that they're making as much money as possible. And if the laws change, they'll change their rules, and it's going to constantly be this game of whack-a-mole where, oh, let's make a rule here, and then the company does this. It's a disaster for everybody. But the real goal of these rules is to force these companies to treat drivers like employees, which they're not. And the problem is, the more that they get treated like employees, the worse for them it is, yet nobody seems to realize it.
Advocates criticized Uber, Lyft, and the TLC for mismanagement of the platforms and overhiring drivers.
We now have a crisis of oversaturation, and instead of paying the drivers for that empty time, the companies are instead punishing the drivers.
The driver is the worker, and it is the worker that creates the profits.
Uber provided.
So these app companies, Uber, Lyft, they're tech companies, right? Well, what have tech companies recently been doing when they realized they overhired employees within the last 2 years? they've been laying people off. And when drivers get locked out of these apps, they're essentially experiencing a micro layoff multiple times a day while they're trying to work. At the same time, critics say these companies are biting the hand that feeds, because without a massive pool of workers ready to accept rides, they couldn't function or run their businesses. Yet at the same time, these companies say that when they started their businesses, they didn't have any types of guaranteed minimum pay for drivers, and things were working out just fine in their opinion. And there weren't complaints from drivers that they couldn't log into these apps and accept jobs. They had full employment back then. But on the flip side, drivers who are not waitlisted are able to benefit from all of the protections that the city has implemented, which means that things are better for them than in an economy that's just a race for the bottom. But since there's now a guaranteed minimum that every single driver has to make when they're working or when they're not working, and there are a limited number of drivers, the prices customers pay are higher, so customers have lost in that arrangement. But if you think the plight of app-based drivers is bad with the high insurance and the criminals that are targeting them, and now the fact that they can't even log in to make a living when they want to anymore, things are actually 2 to 3 times as bad for their counterparts who do food delivery with these very same companies.
In New York City.
But a new law requiring that they be paid a certain wage has come with some unintended consequences, one of them being that they actually earn fewer tips.
All right, Fox 5, Jessica Formoso spoke.
So to an extent, the exact same thing that's happening with Uber drivers is happening with delivery riders at companies like DoorDash. They're now getting locked out of their apps. They actually have to schedule when they want to work because of the new guaranteed wage rules that they have to abide by. It's like the same thing is playing out. It's only 10 times worse for these guys. Now, delivery riders are supposed to be earning a wage of around $20 an hour when they work. But because of these new rules, the fees to use food delivery services have gone through the roof. And what's shocking about that is even though data suggests that the number of deliveries have stayed about the same or even increased in some aspects, the drivers or riders, they're not making what they used to make either. And that's because since the fees are now higher, apparently customers don't have extra money left over to tip. And they can't just work whenever they want to. What they have to do is reserve the days they want to work ahead of time, and then they'll have the right to log in and open up the app on those days only. Otherwise, they'll be locked out just like our drivers are. Now, while the riders are working, they're making 22% more than they were before, but the number of active riders is down about 10%. On top of that, the overall cost to use these apps is about 10% higher. Menu prices are 12% higher, and added fees charged by these apps are 58% higher than they were before. And this has been particularly bad for many of the people in New York who can't get another job other than doing food delivery. In particular, you've got the asylum seekers. Food delivery is one of the only jobs they can get because the great thing about it is the app on your phone speaks whatever language you speak and can tell you how to bring things from point A to point B and earn a living. It was a great system to employ people in some capacity and help them get into the economy in some manner. But now that people are getting locked out and they can't do it like they used to, you've got a lot of folks wondering how they'll ever start to get their feet on the ground here in New York. Not to mention, this is also destroying the income prospects for people who would have done this on a part-time basis in addition to their other full-time work, which sadly reveals that once the government steps in and starts regulating an industry, it does cost jobs, even if those jobs in some people's opinions weren't worth having because they didn't pay enough as far as they were concerned. But this is also terrible for local restaurants. They've been hit really hard by these new rules for delivery riders because over the last 4 years, the demand for delivery-based services has gone way up, and little restaurants that might not have a lot of room inside, they were able to greatly expand their businesses and become much more profitable by having great menu items that people were willing to pay a little bit extra for to have brought to them. Like one local restaurant near where I live, their order volume is down by about 50% because I don't really live in a cool part of town. I live in an off the beaten path part of town where there's virtually no foot traffic. That place is suffering right now. And now workers at that restaurant are losing their jobs. And it's the same thing for all of these companies who were relying on traffic that was getting brought to them, maybe traffic that couldn't get to their business via the subway because public transit's not accessible everywhere in New York, showing that the financial toll being experienced by rideshare drivers is also happening to the businesses that relied on those customers as well. And that brings us to the real reason why we've got companies like Uber and even the Eats companies like DoorDash push, now basically shafting their workforce, stopping them from working. It's because these companies, they just want their service to be affordable so that more people will use it. They're trying to save costs on labor, which are now costs that can't get any lower than they are. And the problem here is that if you mandate a certain price for labor, there will be some companies that say, hey, we cannot afford that job, therefore we're not going to fill that position. We're not going to use that service. That's just the truth. And it's hurting people that used to be able to work whenever they wanted to work, and now in many cases aren't making the same amount of money that they were making before, even though maybe on paper it seemed like their job in the past was actually worse. But here's a question. How important are these jobs for New York City? Is it better to have people not doing anything rather than working in a capacity that a certain person might or might not think is a good capacity, even if they themselves don't do that job? What do you think about that? Should we loosen up the market here so that people can work when they want and accept whatever jobs they want? Or is that a bad idea? Is that going to lead to people being exploited, underemployed, and trapped in an economic cycle they can never escape from? Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.